Oh, Tom, there are no dumb questions.
I can think of a few. Welcome back to Reason Together, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff. I'm Thomas, here, as always, with my good friend Daniel.
Howdy, howdy.
Hey, how we doing?
Doing good. Doing good. Glad to be back.
Yes.
And enjoy this. And as we get started, why don't I say a shout out to our patrons over at patreon.com/Reason Together. We thank you for your support of what we're doing here and just making it easy on us. Has it been within this calendar year that we've been able to hire an actual podcast editor and a blog editor, which helps us to get back to the thing that we really want to do, and that's to get together and talk. And so patrons, thank you very much for your help with that.
Yeah, and along those lines, we do need to mention that we have a couple of new patrons that have joined the Reason Together podcast family, and that, of course, is Matt and David.
Matt and David, thank you. Now, elite patron level here?
Elite patrons, both of them.
Wow, fantastic.
They went for the gusto.
Amazing. Thank you, guys.
Yes, much appreciated to both of you, and welcome. Make sure to take advantage of the perks that come with that. If you haven't already sent us your t-shirt size, be sure to do that. And I do believe I sent out the information to get the after show access to both of them as well. And get on that patron message board and start some conversations and ask some questions and meet the people that are on there. Sometimes it gets a little quiet, but hey, it takes somebody to get in there and say something. So be sure to take advantage of that. But thank you to both of you. We appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. So we've got, I want to ask you, I know things have been really busy for you. And anything you want to share about what's been going on in your life in particular?
The usual. I mean, I don't want to bore people with what is most likely a rather mundane existence, going from work to church to work and to church and to work and to church, like many people. But the work isn't always the same work. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm trying to scale back a little bit on some of that, just for the sake of my family and my ministry, and that should be happening soon. And,
yeah, good.
I did get away for a little bit last weekend. I had an opportunity to go camping for one night.
Really?
But instead of it being on a Friday night to a Saturday night, it was Saturday night into Sunday.
Wow.
And so I made sure I had to prepare for this in advance so that I could go and do this and just have some time of quietness and prayer and thought and study and reading. And that's what it ended up being mostly. It was a ham radio event, but what's nice about the ham radio events is when you go to these in camp, you can kind of go off by yourself and in this huge field, and you can pick a spot over by the tree line, which is what I did, just by myself, quiet. Nobody really came and bothered me. Messed around with the radio for a little bit because, that's what you're supposed to do when you get there. But then I put the radio away and I just got to reading. And I kind of did it mostly just for the camping and not so much for the radio aspect of it. But got up early Sunday morning. I had a good night's sleep there in the tent and packed everything up. It was soaking wet from condensation, and went home and got ready and went to church and preached my messages and fellowship with folks. And it was great. But
wow.
Yeah.
Those that scheduled time to get away, to get apart, and to think and to rest and feed yourself, as it were. That's good. Glad for you.
Yeah.
Well, my family's off in Michigan, and I'm batching it with the kids and the beta fish. I mean, the kids, the cat and the beta
cat.
fish. Yeah.
Yeah, you were telling me about that.
Yeah.
Awfully quiet there.
Yep. At
the moment.
Yeah, I have to make my own noise and all that stuff. Yep. So, but it's nice to have just kind of the freed schedule to just kind of do what you want to do whenever you want to do it and not feel like you're neglecting anybody in the process,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, I
So,
understand.
yeah, last night I was a little frustrated because early this morning, the cat was being annoying and he would walk across the bed. And he's pretty good. He's pretty good when my wife's there, when both of us are there. He knows not to get on the bed, but, walking across my pillow, he'd get up and start messing with the blinds. And I'm laying there thinking, how many windows do I have in this house that he could go look out those windows, but he's got to be at this window messing with the blinds. And then I realized I got up early in the morning and I realized that he was locked in my room because the door to the bathroom was closed and the door to my bedroom was closed. So he was locked in
Yeah.
those two rooms. So after a while, he'd kind of had enough of it maybe and was just going a little stir crazy. And so started playing around. So it really wasn't honestly his fault. I like our cat overall. I wouldn't say like I'm this huge cat lover, but I say he's kind of more like a dog.
I am.
Yeah, good for you.
That was unbridled sarcasm.
That might be as energetic as you get for today, right?
I'm tired. I'm running on low energy right now, so even my sarcasm didn't quite sound like sarcasm. But yes, that was sarcasm. I am not a fan of cats. Cats and I have an understanding. Just whenever we meet each other, you stay in your lane, I'll stay in mine. We won't have any trouble.
All right. Yeah.
That's kind of how it goes.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, I'll go somewhere and a cat breaches that trust and invades my personal space. And
little personal meter goes off.
That's right. I'm not admitting or confessing to striking any cats on this podcast. Not that I would ever do that.
Is that more sarcasm?
Let's just say there's somewhat of a very deliberate nudging that takes place. You know, you nudge me, cat, I'm going to nudge you back. That's just how it is.
You're starting to sound like kids. I didn't hit him. Did you touch him? Yeah. Hard? Yeah. Fast? Yeah. Did you hit him? No. What'd you do? Touched him or whatever. How do you define? Okay, whatever you did, whatever you labeled that, stop doing it. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. No. I was being serious. I don't hit cats, but I will remove them from my personal space.
Well, yeah.
In no uncertain terms. That's just how it is.
In no terms at all. I mean, like there were no verbal expressions at all.
No, just no verbal expression. No, I give him the look.
No facial expression.
That's it. Yep.
All right. Well, we about to let's segue out of our sarcasm section into our question section here, and we've got one here that is from Nathan, and he says, "I've repeatedly heard it said that when the Bible talks about wearing quote modest apparel end quote, the idea is that it should be clothing that does not draw attention to itself." Indeed, the primary New Testament passages dealing with modesty, 1 Timothy 2:8-10 and 1 Peter 3:3-4, make it quite clear that the outward appearance should not be noticeable at all, but that the Christian, a woman in this context, should be notable for her inward beauty. In fact, the New Testament seems to be very clear that Christians should not be defined by any external appearance, but rather by an internally changed heart. He offers a couple references there. So he goes on, in relation to this principle of modesty, I've heard it pointed out that religious groups such as Amish and Mennonites do not practice modesty in their dress because their homemade clothes, bonnets, black hats, etc., actually draw attention to themselves. So he's kind of building his question here. Now he gets to the actual question. This brings up an interesting question when many Baptist men and women wear clothing that is clearly different from what is mainstream in the world. How far should we go in trying not to stand out in our dress? Many Baptist women could be found walking in Walmart in, air quotes, modest clothing that stands out almost as much as an Amish bonnet. So at what point is dressing differently from the world actually immodest because it draws attention to the outward appearance? You understand what he's asking?
Yeah.
Okay.
Short answer, when you dress that way for the attention. Regardless of what kind of attention it is, whether it is a sensual attention or and outlandish attention, meaning everyone look at me, I'm different than all of you, reprobates. Regardless of the type of attention, if you're doing it for the attention, I think that's the point that is being made by the word immodest when we talk about it. That it's being done for the sake of attention. Does that make sense?
It does. So my question in response, I'm going to take a different angle on it here in a minute, but my response would be, are you saying then that intention affects rightness? That basically, if my intent is to draw attention, it is wrong. But if I wear the same thing without the intent to draw attention, it could be right.
Yeah, I would concur with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because
undoubtedly you have some folks that legitimately dress in such a way because they believe that's the only right way to do things, and I'm not here to necessarily debate, what they're wearing, but I'm talking about their reason for it. If they really think that's the right thing to do, but they're maybe not too keen on drawing attention to themselves, but they do it because they think it's right. I think that does have a bearing on it, as opposed to somebody who, and it's essentially grandstanding for some people. You know what I mean? They want everyone around them to know just how much of a reprobate they are. So they're going to dress a certain way to say, I'm not one of you reprobates. And I think the motive changes it.
That's interesting. I would, so on the flip side of that, if somebody is wearing something, they've been raised in a secular home, not much parental guidance, and without much thought necessarily, they wear something relatively provocative. It seemed to me at some point we would say, well, that's immodest, and yet the person's not really meaning to. Person's not meaning to be a harlot, even if they're dressed in the attire of a harlot. Sometimes I'm throwing out a what do you call it, a hypothetical. But would that not be? And I understand. Look, I'm not driving at saying I know that's not the main issue. You see somebody maybe who's unsaved, and the way they dress is not the worst of their issues. They need to be born again. I understand that. But I'm just saying we can objectively look at certain things and say, well, regardless of whether the person knew it was right or wrong, it was wrong. I mean,
well, I think the issue is exactly the same. It's just on two different ends of the spectrum.
Right.
On the one case, you have someone who's convinced they have to dress, and I'm just going to use the word outlandish. They believe that that's right for them to stand out in such a way as being anti-reprobate, right? And then you have the other person who's maybe a new Christian, and they dress immodestly, but they don't really know it's immodest. The exact same issue is apparent in both, and it's simply a lack of education. Both of them need to be educated.
But we're not necessarily
issue.
Talking about what is a righteous attitude, but is the clothing, does it fall into the parameters of immodest? I think that's the question. So are we saying that immodesty is not really a design of, it doesn't have to do with clothing, it has to do with attitude? Is that what you're saying, basically? Then when we're dealing with immodest apparel, we're actually talking about apparel as it applies to an attitude, kind of. I mean, you understand.
Well, they're not mutually exclusive issues.
Well, no,
there is an attitude in the issue. It's not divorced from that at all.
Right.
And there is certain types of clothing that are objectively immodest.
Okay. Regardless of the attitude.
Yeah, regardless of the attitude.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of.
But I think oftentimes people make it so much about the clothing itself. And despite always saying, it's all about the heart, it's all about the heart. And then they proceed to make it all about the clothing. And there's a lot of issues like that, in some circles of our brethren where it's like, oh yeah, we believe it's all a matter of the heart. It's a matter of the heart. And then immediately they make it about, the issue itself. And they don't deal with the heart at all. So yeah, my primary focus in this discussion would be to look at the heart, because honestly, I think there are some, newer Christians who are growing and learning. They have a heart to obey the scriptures. They just don't know what the scripture teaches about everything yet. Right. And I believe that oftentimes will put their heart in a better position, a more mature position, a more godly position than some women who are, dressing to the nth degree of what they consider to be modesty.
Sure.
And yet, they've been saved longer, and their reasons and their motives are entirely wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I believe so. You're basically saying you deal primarily with the heart issue because that's going to put them in better standing, and I do get that. What
Yeah.
you're saying.
Mhm.
I'm looking here. I wanted to look at First Peter, the First Peter 3. Okay, that doesn't actually mention. Okay, I want to take a different angle on it because to me, the way we define words sometimes is. Anyway, it's important how we define words, honestly.
Mhm.
And so when we say that, when we talk about modesty,
What passage are we looking at?
well, I'm going to reference First Timothy 2, um, the First Timothy 2 passage. Now, it's because the word modesty actually isn't mentioned in the Peter passage, but he
Mhm.
mentions in First Timothy 2:9, in like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel. Well, the word modest is cosmios, or let me just double check here in the cosmio. But anyway, it's from the word cosmos, which is that root word from which we get the idea of cosmic or
Orderly.
cosmological. Yes, and so you think about we're not talking about the world in the sense of worldliness, but we're talking about when we talk about the cosmological argument or cosmology, we're talking about the universe and its structure and its orderliness and how it evidences such an arrangement of things,
Yeah.
and it is really pretty amazing. And so when you take that into the idea of apparel that they should wear, clothing that is cosmos, it's that idea of well arranged,
Mhm.
we might say fitting, and of course that's
Sure.
kind of a first cousin to the idea of it being appropriate. It fits in the whole context. So I think that could go
Yeah.
different directions, but
Well, it's really more the other word that's in that verse that lends itself to Nathan's point in his question, which
okay.
is the word shamefacedness, as it's rendered here. Which I'm looking at my defined King James Bible here,
Mm-hmm.
which defines that as bashfulness or shyness, a sense of shame or bashfulness is what it says. So it kind of repeats itself a little bit. But the idea, not that someone has to be seen and not heard, but the idea that someone should not be seeking attention for themselves.
Which with that shamefacedness, I guess I would say, especially, that would seem to be not drawing attention to themselves in an immoral way, in a way that would, appeal to
Yeah.
the moral nature of people. In other words, that it is sensuous, it makes thoughts arise, things like that. But I think this is my personal take on it. I think personally, the statement that says clothing is not supposed to draw attention to itself, or that if you notice it at all, it's wrong. I think that's a little overwrought.
Well, it's also impossible to really know that or measure that in any way
Yes,
at all.
yes. But I mean, I guess I would have to argue that, you are not merely a Christian, but you are a Christian who's wearing something,
Yeah.
and so your clothing ought to be fitting to who you say you are. But
Yeah.
that certainly, there's to me a broad scope um, uh, of appropriateness, that should take into account the way that the fact that the world includes beauty, that there is such
Hmm.
a thing as style, and so I mean, to understand that God's given us the ability to craft these things. In fact, it's a gift, and what we wouldn't say, you shall wear all things gray because color draws attention. Well, no, that's the point. I mean, that color makes things beautiful. Now, if it draws so much attention that it's distracting,
Yeah.
and I mean distracting probably in a bad way, but I mean, we might go,
Yeah.
obviously we could look this, it is subjective in the point of style. Okay. And
Yeah.
I
You
know,
you are indicating a gray area here.
yes, I understand that there is a point where we say, no, that seems to be definitely fleshly, that the exposing of certain things would be considered nudity, whatever. But to say, oh, that's flamboyant, like she's wearing a red vest. Okay, great. Oh,
Mhm.
well, he's wearing a plaid bow tie. Really? I mean, who can't not notice a bow tie,
Yeah.
Um, but but it doesn't mean that it's immodest because it draws attention. It's just it is a fashion statement, and that's constantly in flux. And
Mhm.
to realize that the world is trying to project its own style and fashion. So to monitor whether we are actually godly by whether we fit into the world's fluctuation of style, to me is a little problematic. So our
What do you mean? Can you rephrase that?
Sure. What I mean by let me step back and say, if the styles are coming out of France or coming out of wherever the newest models are walking down the catwalk, and they're exhibiting these certain styles, and at first they're like, oh, whoa, weird, new, different, well, that's constantly happening. They're constantly coming out
Mhm.
with new styles, and yes, we see the circular nature of them, the rotation of styles, bell bottoms every 75 years, whatever. But the point is that the world, I'm talking about unregenerate people in large part, are determining the new style that's going to be in vogue in the next year or two. Well, then I
Right.
say,
Right.
well, I'm different. I'm dressing different than the world because I wear a skirt and they have, not me personally, but I mean, or I wear this sort of, I wear a shirt and tie. Well, shirt and tie, you're out, man. The new style is this. Well, now my godliness, my modesty is being gauged by the world's standard of normalcy, which is constantly in flux. So
Right.
I think that's
Right.
problematic to say, well, if it stands out, meaning if it's different than normal, meaning it's different than the mass of humanity. Um, well, I don't think we've probably defined that maybe as well as we should. You know,
Right. Because it doesn't acknowledge the fact that culture and time does change.
right?
And like most people who would say, I dress modestly, aren't acknowledging that what they're wearing, and I'm talking about both men and women, may have been considered kind of worldly 100 years ago,
Sure.
right? Um, so there is some fluctuation in what people think is just different. That's going to be different 100 years from now, and so on.
Well,
Um, and the what was I going to say? There was even with the idea of separateness in clothing, right?
mhm.
Which is a huge discussion, and really I feel like in many ways we're kind of beating a dead horse here and maybe hanging on to this talk a little too long. But for instance, if we want to talk about men in particular, well, I need to dress separately from the world. Well, what degree exactly are you referring to? Because the world wears pants, the world wears jeans,
right,
you're
exactly, right,
probably wearing jeans right now.
right,
So it's like, do you see the difference there? It's like, okay, separateness in what sense are you
right,
talking?
right, right.
Um, because modesty is one issue, separateness is another when we talk about clothing. So
Right, I was going to say that, yeah, and I agree that that's not the only issue when we talk about modesty. Of course, there's distinction, there's different things,
mhm,
but it just in talking about modesty and defining it that way to say that it shouldn't be noticed, well, or it shouldn't define you. Oh, okay, okay. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, obviously, you want the most defining part of you to be um, that expression of you that mirrors your Christianity, that you're a joyful person, that
mhm,
you're a positive person, you're a hard worker. Okay, yeah, but it doesn't mean that you won't have stylistically uniquenesses about you in the same way that our personalities are God made, and yet there is a sinful bent to them. So our
mhm.
personality can be expressed in our clothing, and yet we have to be aware of the sinful bent of our personality and being expressed in our clothing. So um, I think I'm going back to even the original definition that the idea you shouldn't draw attention to yourself. Okay, if we mean by that it's an obvious eye catcher. I'm wearing this to make men take a double take. Because
Mhm.
and see me as sexy and hot. I'm saying from a woman's perspective. Well, okay, yeah, right. And you said, well, let's go with the heart issue. Obviously, the heart issue would take care of that.
Mhm.
Um, But I'm just saying that within that, not drawing attention to itself, I don't think that's really maybe a great expression of that concept of modesty. But there's a pretty broad range there.
Well, yeah, and even in some cases, no matter how quote unquote modest a woman dresses, she's going to draw attention in some way to somebody. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's just a fact of life. So there's so many weeds in this entire discussion that almost getting into the particulars of it is like the whole thing just dies the death of 1,000 cuts, because there's so many different subjective aspects of it, and there's so many different exceptions to things and so on. So it's a difficult discussion. So
yeah. So my caution would be that it's a discussion to be had. I mean, it's something to think about because it's there. The Bible uses the word, but I'm just saying we have to define the word appropriately to have a productive discussion. That's the underlying thought. Okay. Thank you, Nathan.
Speaking of defining words, thank you, Nathan. Speaking of defining words, I'm sitting here. I mentioned earlier, I'm looking at my defined King James Bible, and maybe this is a dumb question, but perhaps you have some insights on it.
There are no dumb questions.
I can think of a few.
Actually, there are dumb questions, but I had to repeat that.
There are in fact
common
dumb
misconception.
I'm looking at this defined King James Bible, and this is not my primary Bible anymore. I use it for years. I used this, but now I have a different one that I preach from. But I was using this one to preach from for quite some time, and they have the basic idea of the defined King James Bible is that they have words that they have deemed archaic.
Okay.
And they bold them. They essentially highlight them in the text. And they put a little superscription above it, a number above it, that directs you down to a footnote.
Okay.
And the footnote gives you a contemporary word in English that explains what the archaic word means.
Okay.
And it just dawned on me while I was looking at this a few weeks ago. Like, there's a good, at least where I'm looking right now, I'm looking in 1 Timothy 3, where we were a minute ago, and we're looking at the word shamefacedness. You know, there's about, I'd say, 5 inches difference between where the word shamefacedness lands on the page and its footnote, where it says bashfulness or shyness. It's about 6 inches below down in the footnote. And I thought, these folks went through a lot of work to find these words in here and give a contemporary definition of it in the footnote. They went through a lot of effort. And really, the only difference between this and a version that is written in contemporary English is about 5 inches. So my thought was, am I off base here for wondering why they couldn't just take the footnote word and just stick it up in the verse where it belongs instead of what may be considered an archaic word? Another example of that, I was looking at a moment ago, was in Romans 13, the word chambering, the word wantonness, right?
Concupiscence, lasciviousness.
Yeah. In this case, the difference is probably no more than 1.25 inches from chambering in the text down to the footnote, where it says sexual indulgence or lewdness. Maybe this would anger people for me to even ask this question, but why not just take that word and move it up 1.25 inches and stick it right there in a verse? I mean, am I asking for something that is considered unrealistic or off base here?
Well, I'll tell you what.
So why?
The practical effect would be that you would lose. You would be disenfranchised immediately by some strong KJV advocates.
This is true.
Yes. So,
but yet, this entire translation, this entire edition here by D.A. Waite, is done by people who are very strong King James Version advocates. They are in fact that. So they are acknowledging, by even making this in the first place, there are archaic words here that we would like to give a contemporary definition of, and they even stick it in there. But what are they acknowledging when they put it in a footnote instead of just in the verse? Why do that?
I
Is
don't.
there some spiritual attachment to the word chambering or wantonness that we're unwilling to put the footnoted word right up there in the verse?
Yeah. I guess that'd be for them to answer. I mean, as far as I don't see all the definitions there in front of you. So, like, sometimes is it too long to put into the verse? Like when they give two, when you
No,
said you looked up one and it said, and it gave two answers. Well, they're not going to stick them both in the verse. So you're just saying they'd have to choose one, and yet they kind of might give slightly different takes on the word.
I suppose that's possible, but I mean, that would be the same case for any translating you
Right,
do, whether it's
right.
Bible or otherwise. There's going to be like 90 words that could be used for one word in a different language. So it's like, I don't know. I'm just wondering, I mean, is this going to freak anybody out? Just me asking this. This seems to me like an honest question, like a fair question. Why not just, if you're going to do all that work of putting these words down in the footnote, why not just stick it up in the verse? Or is there some spiritual attachment to words like shamefacedness?
Now, I can't say that there's a spiritual attachment to it. You just have to trust your translator to put a fitting replacement in. You know what I mean? But I see what you're saying. I mean, basically that's what they did. They just didn't. They kept it separate so as to maintain the original, and by that the 1769.
Well,
whatever.
I mean, they essentially have created a contemporary translation of the
Right,
Bible
right.
without admitting that they created a contemporary translation of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And they do that just by putting it in a footnote rather than in the verse. And it seems to me like, well, if you're going to do that, just do it, right?
I see what you're saying. Now I'm going to throw in, not that I'm holding on to the archaic language just for the sake of archaic language, but when you start to say, okay, this guy, and I don't know who all is involved in that. I'm not really very familiar with that study Bible, but okay, this guy has the right to pick words and substitute the archaic words for him. Well, the next guy comes around, he goes, I don't like that replacement. I'd actually use this word. Well, he comes out with his translation. Somebody else says, I would use, I think there's a couple other words that are archaic. I'll stick in a couple, and he comes out with his translation. Well, then you're not really homogenous on one translation. And even with something as simple as getting your kids to memorize scripture. Oh, I memorized the weight translation. Oh, well, you've got the, the whatever translation, so that word's a little different. And so it actually throws a little wrench into it.
I think there's value in
having a
memorizing from one version of the Bible. And I like the King James. I've used it my whole life. I don't plan on not using it, right? I'm not going to throw it out.
Yeah, no.
But what I mean is, like, for instance, like you said, you got different people coming up with a different word. Well, I don't like his choice of word. I'm going to use this word. Well, when the translators of any kind look up any kind of word in the original, they're all doing that. They're all picking a word. I mean, that's how the King James translators did it. They pick a word in the English that suits the original. And there's any number of choices for them to pick from, and they picked one. And does that make sense?
Yeah, but maybe this isn't the question you're asking, but I guess my thought is that if we're talking about, I'm not against the concept of a modern English translation, that we don't, the point is that we believe that the King James has been the, most accurate translation from the best manuscripts. But so that doesn't rule out that, you could modernize the language. However, in order to keep sort of Christianity on a unified translation so as to minimize confusion and enable, whatever, memorization and preaching, whatever, then it seems to me that if you were going to do that, you would want to make it a big deal, in the sense that we're getting together a committee of scholarship as well, and so that across camps, whatever, we're working together with men who are able to pick the words, and we've agreed. Okay, so in essence, that you're trying to create the next standard version, and I mean from the correct text, because obviously that's been attempted many times with the other text, but the next standard version for the American public. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? And instead of just one guy going, I would replace the archaic words with this, and a few thousand people buy it, and somebody else
Yeah.
comes along and says, well, I don't do that. Well, why don't you? So
Yeah.
why don't they try to make it a bigger work that says, look, this is it. However, I do think you have a lot that are really attached to the King James, and not for necessarily bad reasons either. They just they love the flow of it, the richness of it. Okay, and they honestly don't feel that the archaic, which I can understand, that the archaic words are really a detriment to someone who actually just wants to put in a little bit of elbow grease and study it, and figure out what it means. But just because people are so attached to it, then are you really going to ever have a market for something that tries to replace the King James? And then if it's not going to have a market, why make it? And, but if they could keep it as the King James with some explanations, okay, that sells. You know what I mean? And I don't mean that from a total marketing thing, but okay, now we're helping people to understand it. It's still the King James. So you have the market for it, and there you go.
So you're saying it may be some sort of appeasement, or trying to have the best of both worlds, as it were.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that probably is honestly kind of the best of both worlds at this point.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for indulging me on that one.
Yeah.
Just it got me thinking. I'm like, it's only 1.25 inches.
Okay. Well, speaking of reading, if we were speaking of that, maybe not a slightly awkward segue into
sort of tangentially, we were.
Okay, a few questions for you. I'm talking about reading now. How important is it in, like to be able to read your tomato soup label? No, I just mean, how important should it be first in the life of anybody? Reading. I mean, this a habit of finding books, reading them, reading other people. How important is that?
Very.
Okay. How important is it to a leader? I mean, when a leader thinks of how he divides his time, I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this. Give me a relative weight that reading should play in his priorities. I mean, is that something that he should structure time, even a fair amount of time, doing?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm looking for maybe a difficult part of the question, but I mean, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I think that should be high on the priority, especially if the guy is not maybe inclined to be a reader.
Right. I think a number of people aren't.
Yeah, and some folks just are. They just read things, and they don't really need a reminder. They don't need to prioritize it. They just do. They have an inherent curiosity about all sorts of things. So they read and they study and they learn and they develop themselves. So it's
okay. Yeah. Let me hone it down here a little bit so that the question's more focused. As far as a pastor, someone in ministry, obviously you would say it's still very important. Why is it important? Why is it important to read what someone else has to say about something?
Are we talking about like theological material or?
Sure. Well, I'd say theological or ministry. I mean, anything that men in ministry would read that would be seemingly valuable. I mean, they're not just going to read systematic theologies all day. They read, books on, parenting and technology and, blah, blah, blah. Why is that important?
I'll answer this with a quote.
Okay.
That was sent to me actually earlier today, and I thought this was really good. And serendipitously, it fits with what you're asking.
Okay.
And the quote is this: if you think you know everything there is to know on a topic, it is true for you because you are not capable of learning anything else.
Ooh.
It's a stinging challenge riposte is what it is, but nevertheless true that someone who feels that they know everything there is to know on a topic, really it is true for them. They do know everything there is to know because they know everything they can know. They're not a person who is capable of learning anything else. They feel like they've reached the top. And I think that's why it's important for pastors to read, because and this may be an earth-shattering truth for some pastors out there or some armchair theologians out there, The only immutable being is God. And I've heard pastors say, "Oh, I haven't changed in 40 years. Well, then you're not reading and you're not growing.
Mm-hmm.
There are, and I'm not talking about just the sanctification against the flesh. Yes, we should all be changing in that area. And I think pastors who say such things would admit to it changing, at least in areas of gaining victory over their flesh and change in that way. Sure, they would confess to that. But I mean, even honing and developing your viewpoints on things, right? You if you believe the same exact things you believed when you were 11 in the exact same way, I seriously kind of doubt you. And I wonder if I can take you seriously, because am I really to believe that an 11-year-old has been given every single possible right view of everything, and they understood it and they studied it and they developed it and honed it, and now they can now articulate it to someone else? No, in all likelihood, no. And you're going to find, if you're a reading Christian, a growing Christian, you're going to start to develop as you mature and as you age as an adult. And you might say, well, I believed that. And I wonder if maybe I didn't quite understand that issue like I should have. And I think we're afraid to admit that sometimes because, we like it for everyone to believe that we're never wrong about anything. But the fact is we are. And I would have more respect for a guy who says, I studied this issue out for, 7 years and realized that maybe I was wrong about that. I'd have more respect for that than a guy who says, I knew everything I believed from the time I was a teenager and have never changed. Mm-hmm. So something to me is fishy about a guy who says that.
Okay. I have a couple more questions about this, but we're going to carry them into the after show. Yeah. We're going to close it down for today. And thank you for listening. If you got any questions, comments, responses, just thoughts that come to your mind and you're wondering how you connect them in life, how you balance them, how it jives or is consistent with something else, we'd be glad to possibly bat that around. But just send it to reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
All right. Well, thank you for being with us on this episode. We are encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice, and encouraging you to read. This is Reason Together.